Hello and welcome to this Conversations on Groong episode. Today we're talking with the Executive Director of the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention, Dr. Elisa von Joeden-Forgey, to discuss the case of genocide in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as other humanitarian red flags around the world that the Institute has raised. Hello, Dr. von Joeden-Forgey.
Hello.
Hello, it's so nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Dr. von Joeden-Forgey, can we begin with a quick background on your institute? Your institute, I believe, is relatively new, and this is the first time on our show. So please tell us a little bit about yourself and about also the Lemkin Institute and its founding.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so the Lemkin Institute is new, and it emerged actually out of a trip that a colleague and I took to northern Iraq in 2016. So my colleague Irene Victoria Massimino, who is an Argentine human rights lawyer and a specialist in genocide law, the law of genocide, we were invited by a small NGO that was sort of co-chaired by Yazidis and Christians in northern Iraq when we were members of the International Association of Genocide Scholars' executive board. The board was invited to come and witness ISIS genocides. And we went along with one colleague, Shell Anderson, who's also a genocide scholar. My background is in history. I'm a historian. I, have over 30 years as a historian and an academic and a professor. But, halfway into my career, I began to find it very difficult to simply study genocide. And so I got involved in this sort of emerging field of genocide prevention. And I had done, before going to Iraq, several trainings, for trainings of government officials, military officers through existing genocide prevention organizations. But we really went to Iraq simply to witness, right? Because at that time, this was 2016, although there was a lot of reporting about northern Iraq, there wasn't an appreciation globally of the genocidal dimensions of what was going on there. And while we were there, we traveled through the war zone, right? Through the unsecured war zone. We saw newly discovered mass graves. We met with religious leaders, IDPs, members of all the various faiths that were targeted by ISIS, with government officials, both Iraqi government officials and KRG, Kurdish government officials. We just met with everybody that we could to hear what was going on. What is this? And while we were there, it became very apparent to us that our current genocide prevention models are severely lacking, or that there were great gaps, right, in what the world is calling genocide prevention and how this really sort of evolves on the ground. And so what we really saw was a community that had been left vulnerable to genocide, with nobody concerned about their future. And this is particularly the Yazidis, but also Christians in the Nineveh Plain. So they've been left vulnerable to genocide. There's a long history here, but especially after the US's invasion in 2003. So much of the kind of genocidal displacement had been ongoing from 2003, when we're talking about the Christians in particular. So they've been left vulnerable. And then afterwards, there were no immediate plans for how to deal with this genocide. So, for example, when we were showed mass graves, some of them were famous, like people knew those mass graves existed through the news, but they'd been discovered by Kurdish forces. And there was no international organization that sent lawyers to secure the mass graves, to secure the evidence. And so I asked one Kurdish official who was with me at one of the mass graves, how is this being secured? Like, what is this? There was no even marker, that it was a mass grave. You knew mass graves because there were blankets. The Pashinyan April would put blankets over the areas, and then there would be, it's heartbreaking, but there would be empty water bottles and people's flip-flops. These were the victims. These belonged to the victims. But there were no real markers. And he said, we don't know what to do, and we don't have any help. So sometimes at night times, the dog comes and digs up the bones and takes them and chews them, right, in the shrub and the bushes. And then we have to go find them in the morning and put them back in. So you can imagine the difficulties this causes for evidence. And so this was true also, in the IDP camps, which the Kurds were doing, the best that they could to try and run. And but there was I don't know, the IDPs were insecure even from the Kurdish government, and there was no help for women who'd been rescued from ISIS captivity. There was nothing for them to do. And the international community, we saw this, they were flying in and out of Erbil, flying in and out, but they'd stay for a few days a week. This is reporters, human rights workers, UN, and then they'd leave, and we would hear from the IDPs, because we asked them to just tell us what they want to tell us. We'd hear that they're being abused, they're being exploited by the international community, and nobody is helping them, right? And so that's a very common thing, but it was very stark to see this up front and to see that there was just no plan for these people. And we see that now they're still mostly displaced, and they're leaving Iraq in huge numbers. And so these are going to be total genocides eventually. And so this was just, we we realized many things. And one of I think the most important things we realized was that genocides tend to be treated, especially in prevention, as localized, nation-bound events that emerge out of the kind of organic history of these smaller territories. And what we saw, however, was a global genocide. This was all about, geostrategy. This was all about resources. And this was all about external actors. Yes, there's always some local thing that can be exploited or that is already going in that direction. But this, to call this sort of like an Iraq-based thing didn't make any sense. And so we realized that what was needed was some kind of organization that was not beholden to any government, large funding organization, political party, ideology, et cetera, right? And that could just speak the facts, right? And so we started something called the Iraq Project for Genocide Prevention. And actually, we began on a grassroots level, right? That's the core mission, is to work with the global grassroots. And so we went back to Kurdistan. We never had any. I hear like scholars, they went to Iraq and they had all of this protection, right? And all this security. I have to laugh because we had nothing. We had zero, right?
You didn't have PPE or anything, right?
Nothing. Zero, right? Like, I did speak to someone who said you need a go bag in case a bomb goes off, so you can like cauterize, whatever. So I learned some of those, but we had no one. We drove around with the Yazidis and Christians and Kurds and in little cars. So anyway, so we went back and we would do these for a year. We did these grassroots genocide prevention workshops. We called them boot camp, very American style, and we sort of took the elite training, right, that people receive in the UN and in governments, and we codified it into a very neutral curriculum, and we presented it all over northern Iraq. We wanted to go, right, to southern Iraq, but at that time it was too dangerous. We did this and it was great. People, Yazidis, Christians, Shabak, Shia, Kakai, right, like all of these groups that had been impacted by ISIS came, and there were debates about who had a genocide and who didn't. And sort of like this sort of competitive suffering was worked out. And really, these were strong debates, but they were very harmonious in the end, and they created interfaith, transnational NGOs, grassroots NGOs within Iraq that didn't exist before. So we really saw the power of that. And we also, in all these conversations that we had with people, we saw that, the Iraqis bring incredible insight into the genocidal process that, gets lost in these elite circuits of genocide prevention completely. So, for example, I credit the Yazidi really with bringing to global attention the gendered patterns of genocide. They knew because this is how genocide has always been committed against the Yazidis. They knew immediately they were experiencing genocide. They call it firman. Their grandmothers and great-grandmothers had told the young women about very similar experiences they had had. So the women knew, oh my God, we're being taken captive, and this is a genocide, and they're going to kill the men and take us. They knew that. But then they brought the leaders, right? Male leaders of the Yazidi community brought that message globally. And suddenly you saw like John Kerry in the US and all these folks speaking in gender-sensitive language about genocide. Now, I'm a gender scholar, and I had never seen this before. I never had that impact. So I really credit the Yazidis with bringing sort of, gender-sensitive understandings of genocide, which are very helpful, right, to the global community. So that's how we originated. We had to, during the pandemic, because no one can travel, right, we had to kind of change our mission. And so we just took that mission and made it global. So that's the background to Lemkin.
Dr. von Joeden-Forgey, tell us how that background translated into a mission for your organization, your funding sources, because I really liked when you said that, this was essentially a bootstrap project for you. And is it still a bootstrap project?
100.
And it resonates with us because our podcast as well is a bootstrap project. We spend so much time as professionals in a completely different area, but we feel that this type of content is needed. So we're happy to do it. So your mission, your funding, as well as I really admire what you said in terms of starting the grassroots work. And then I really admire the independence that I have seen so far from your institute in terms of potential government. So how do you manage to do that? Just a little bit about that as well.
Well, it's not easy, as you guys know, right? So I was a professor at Stockton University and then at Keene State College, which was in New Hampshire. Stockton University was in New Jersey while I was doing all of this work. And then, academia, I got laid off from my endowed chair position in September last year. But this was part of retrenchment. I'm not going to get into like the dynamics of U.S. academia, but where you could sort of lay off tenured faculty, even endowed faculty, if there seems to be a need to do so. And the need at Keene State College was that they didn't want chairs. They wanted to create these super departments that didn't have chairs. And I was an endowed chair, so I was the only professor who had a kind of contract as a chair. So they had to get rid of that contract. Anyway, so I got a severance pay, right? And so that's now paying my salary, right, as Lemkin Institute. So I thought, well, okay, I'll just take the time to focus on Lemkin Institute. So we have no funders. So my salary is paid by a severance I got after losing my job. And everyone else is a total volunteer.
Wow, that's admirable from the contributions from your side, but too bad that there isn't easy, funding for this type of stuff.
Well, there isn't, and this is the thing we realized is that there is no funding, I think, for honest genocide prevention work. And so we're not encouraged, we don't want to change the model unless there is a source of funding that wouldn't be problematic. And we would look at that very, very carefully, or unless we can find a way to bring in some money. I would like these young people. So it's mostly young people that volunteer. Many of them work full time. And so they decide, to live at home after graduating from, master's program or whatever, and they put full time, but eventually they have to leave because everyone needs to have an income. Right. And then they'll still stay on for 2 hours a week or something like that. Or people leave and then they lose their jobs and they come back to us. So we have a revolving door. We have a pretty large network of people now that have come through Lemkin Institute. But our average donation is like $10, so we have like maybe $100 a month budget. And every once in a while, that will pay for our people to go, maybe one person to go to Geneva, for example, to represent us at an important UN thing. So, for example, we got some money that allowed us to send 2 people in the fall to represent the Karakalpak people at the UN Minority Forum. So every once in a while, we're able to put together that sort of thing and do something a little more impactful, right, in a pragmatic and direct way than writing statements. But, mostly what we do are things that don't cost money except in terms of time. And we just have, I can't describe how much I value these people that I work with who give their weekends and their evenings and all their free time to doing free labor in the name of global genocide prevention. But we piss everybody off at some point, and so that's why there's no money.
It comes with the territory of doing a labor of love.
Precisely.
And being independent.
Precisely. I'm sorry I used that word. I hope you don't have to cut it out, but it's not NPR, right? So we can say that word.
I think it'll be fine.
But, yeah. But we do, and you have to, in genocide prevention, you have to be able to pivot very quickly because things happen, right? Like I was actually sort of happy not to be at a university after September 19th, the Artsakh Genocide, and October 7th, the Gaza Genocide, because, as Lemkin Institute, we have to call things as we see them. And particularly the Gaza Genocide doesn't earn you any friends in academia. And as a proud chair in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, it would have been a lot of drama. So my husband always says to me, this happened at exactly the right time. You didn't have to deal with that drama because as Lemkin Institute, you guys can say what you honestly believe without any problem.
Your organization has been outspoken in support of the right of Artsakhtsis, people from Nagorno-Karabakh, to live on their own historic lands. The very first red flag alert that you raised back in 2021 was in fact about Artsakh. And those red flag alerts were issued regularly until September 2023, when after a short but deadly war, Artsakh was forcefully depopulated of all of the indigenous people, the Armenians. The harrowing scenes of the slow procession of cars and people through the Lachin corridors to Armenia was sort of reminiscent for those of us who've seen a lot of genocide pictures of these photographs of people going through the desert in 1915. And so it was very difficult. Your red flags were sort of prophetic. And unfortunately, the global powers today seem ready to accept what happened, at least for now. How did we get here? And what can be learned from Artsakh in order to prevent future genocides?
Oh, that's such a great question. I have to start by saying what happened in Artsakh broke our hearts. It really broke our hearts. And we did wonder afterwards, should we even continue as an organization? Not because everything was staked on Artsakh, but because Artsakh is a canary in a coal mine. And what it said to us was that the world tolerates genocide. It might try to dress it up in a way that doesn't seem to conform to the kind of Holocaust model of genocide, but the world and the Western world, to whom human rights organizations always make their pleas, right, was not only silent, but totally complicit. So I think what we've learned from Artsakh is that this is what I've learned, and I think how Lemkin Institute is now operating. I operate with an executive committee, by the way, and we speak, who are also volunteers, and we speak about all of these things. So it's not like a one-man show, right? But what we learned and what we've talked a lot about is that there's a new era of imperialism, that the masks are off, that the West is engaged in this imperialism alongside Russia and China. All of the great powers are committing genocide or somehow implicated in genocide, and they're accepting that. They'll call each other out, but they won't direct that same critique at their own policies and at themselves. And this means that one requires a sort of new model of genocide prevention. It proved to us the importance of our unfunded model, because no one was going to lose their jobs if a funder pulled their funding from Lemkin Institute, if we called out Gaza, or if we pushed really hard at the US State Department with Artsakh. We weren't going to lose State Department funding. The US State Department funds most genocide prevention organizations. So we learned that that money, right, comes with strings attached. And so we learned the value of not having those strings attached. We learned that,
let me just say that both Hovik and I were actually talking about this, and we were amazed that these statements were coming out. And we thought, how come these are the only people who can speak up like this?
Right.
How come there are not other institutes speaking up?
Yes, the International Association of Genocide Scholars also spoke up at some point, and Genocide Watch as well. But yes, I think we were on there early, right, in that circuit early. And Genocide Watch, I learned our model from Genocide Watch. I want to give credit where credit is due. It also does not accept money from anywhere and works on a shoestring budget. But yeah, why wasn't anyone else saying things? Well, it's the association of genocide prevention with Western democracies. And for a long time, they have been pursuing genocide prevention. And there have been many critics of this. And I myself was a critic of this, but I didn't appreciate how deep it went. But they've been doing genocide prevention as if prevention is something that's done by foreign countries in countries experiencing genocide, right? Overlooking how foreign countries can initiate, cover up, give diplomatic cover to, right? Be complicit in genocide like we saw in Artsakh. In Artsakh, everyone was complicit. I mean, I think everyone was complicit. All states involved in that region were complicit in this genocide for different reasons. The biggest reason is, I think that the Organization of Turkic States is being seen as a beachhead to trade in Central Asia and the Caspian Sea, and everybody wants to be part of that. Everyone wants to be included in that. And so there's just no state that was really willing to go out on a limb for 120,000 indigenous people in Nagorno-Karabakh, in the Republic of Artsakh, right? And that was just a horrific thing to say. So our genocide prevention mechanisms are broken. They're not actually real. The thing that we can say about Artsakh is that the Western powers that were involved, and here I mean the EU, the European Commission, and the United States, they knew what was happening. And I don't just mean that because Lemkin Institute wrote things, and Moreno Ocampo said stuff. And they knew because many of them have gone through the genocide prevention trainings that have been used by other prevention groups. So they knew what to look for. And they know very well that the model in Artsakh is a model of genocide. That's a pattern of genocide. They know all of this.
So, in fact, they not only know all of this, shortly before September 2023, like 5 days before the war started, the U.S. government seemed to have an uncompromising stand. And the words of Yuri Kim resonate in my head, that, ethnic cleansing, she said, will not be tolerated. But her silence afterwards was even more deafening to me. Oh. And same with Samantha Power and, all these like big names in genocide studies now like being silent. So I wanted to ask, at the risk of people laughing at this, I wanted to ask what the role of the so-called international community here is and what were the failings. But then I caught myself and thought, okay, is it even appropriate to use that term? But for posterity, let's assume there's some international community still existing. What was their role that they chose to ignore conveniently?
Their role, I think it's very simple. Their role was to recognize Azerbaijan as a state that is founded on, let's be a little more mild, right? That a state that now espouses official genocidal Armenophobia. And to call that out and to isolate that and to somehow protect Azerbaijan's neighbors from that. That was their role. They knew. Aliyev does not hide this. I always point out that his speeches are translated into English on Azerbaijan's website. It's official website. So, it's not like, you don't have to go looking and find someone who speaks Azeri to know what he's saying about Armenians. So this is what they were supposed to do. And there are mechanisms, right? There are policies. There's a toolbox, that can be used when you see this expression of genocidal intent by a state leader. That's what they should have done.
Obviously, though, that toolbox was not used. It failed. Mm-hmm. Is that a bad omen for the future in terms of, or is that the, new normal? Yes. Because, for instance, after the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, James O'Brien, I call him James No Business As Usual because he did say there will be no business as usual with Azerbaijan from now on. Said that the U.S. is putting together a comprehensive, thorough, and transparent record of what transpired. That was back in November last year. Then they proceeded to sign more contracts between Azerbaijan and EU. The U.S. welcomed Azerbaijan's more prominent role as part of COP29 and so forth. And then less than 2 weeks ago, Brian was here in Armenia, and he mentioned the same old thing, that they commissioned this report. And until that report is released, they will not be able to say if this is ethnic cleansing or immigration. And that was really insulting to even hear him say that word, immigration. Is it really so difficult to uncover what happened? Yeah. And doesn't this mean that basically that toolbox that you're talking about doesn't exist or essentially is not valid in these cases?
Absolutely. It exists on paper, but not in reality. People are operating in bad faith. This is gaslighting, classic gaslighting. And they have goals, right? This is not stupidity. I hear some people say the U.S. just doesn't know what it's doing. No, right? I don't believe that at all. They have goals, geostrategic goals that they think are worth genocide. That's it. And they're, stringing people along with these reports and this, this word play, right? These sort of these fake definitional disputes. Is it forced displacement, ethnic cleansing, or immigration? I mean, yeah. So I think this is a game.
If, as you're saying, genocide prevention is no longer a priority for these many states, because basically that's what we're saying. Does this indicate that the United Nations, for whom the charter basically says that this is a top priority, is a failing institute?
Yes. In terms of this, yes. In terms of genocide prevention, yes. And it's being made complicit in so many ways. Yes, absolutely. It's failing. And the Office of Genocide Prevention is failing. There's so many pressures on that office, and it's also not well funded. So there's not much they can do. It's not a critique of the people in that office. I think they're great. It really is that the office itself is not set up to work. And this shows the limits of the way we've been doing genocide prevention, depending on the goodwill of Western nations, has been a huge mistake. And we need to go in different directions, and in particular, I think there are some solutions. One is that we need to train the grassroots globally to be organized to fight against genocide, to hold their own leaders accountable, to fight genocidal patterns in the long term within their own countries, because it's the grassroots that mostly suffer from genocide, and therefore they have the greatest interest in preventing it. But also we need to encourage the global South to be more involved in genocide prevention, because this kind of Western-led type of genocide that we saw in Artsakh, it's something they've experienced, and they see it and they know it. And sometimes smaller nations show more courage, perhaps because the stakes are less, although one can argue the stakes are more. They don't have much power against these huge hegemons, right? But sometimes they show more courage because imbricated deeply in their hearts is their own experience of genocide and colonialism and losing territory or losing memory or losing identity. And they understand how deeply, deeply that harms humanity, and particularly specific groups in the short and the long term.
Hey folks, we hope you're enjoying this Conversations on Groong episode with the Lemkin Institute's Executive Director, Elisa von Joeden-Forgey. If you appreciate what you're hearing on the show, please join many of your fellow listeners by going to podcasts.groong.org/donate and support us.
Hovik, let's also take a moment to thank many of our listeners and friends who have stepped up to support us. Their contributions are already making a difference in our outreach. This is the goal of our campaign. We bring to you 100% independent, non-agenda discussions that analyze topics in the Armenian world, in discussions with experts and specialists with solid experience, whether that be in politics, the arts, business, economy, or whatever.
Folks, we do not take funding from NGOs or any institutional donors. All we have is our pocketbooks and you, our listeners. We plan to keep up our work because we see how much our listeners are appreciating it. And there is definitely a thirst for clear and truthful material out there, and we'd like to reach out more listeners with our work.
And that is where you come in. So please go to podcasts.groong.org/donate and become a sustaining member with a recurring contribution.
Thank you in advance. Now back to our conversation with Elisa von Joeden-Forgey.
This year, on April 24, Pashinyan, during his address on the occasion of the Armenian Genocide, issued a statement that came under criticism from the Lemkin Institute, as well as a lot of Armenian quarters. The full statement is linked in our show notes, but one of the key eye-catching aspects of that statement was that he used the term medzierern frequently. In the first paragraph of the statement, he mentions the term Armenian Genocide, but also in parentheses, he mentions medzierern as a way of introducing the new term, and then he proceeds to exclusively use that term. Medzierern has been used by Pashinyan recently. It's a statement from the days of the Obama administration. Those of us who've been around for a while remember that. And that's a time when diplomats were trying to identify a euphemism to use for the Armenian genocide without actually using the word genocide. On May 10, your institute issued a statement titled Statement Condemning Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's Cryptic Engagement with Genocide Denial. Why did you decide to issue this statement? And also, what is the issue with using the term medzierern instead of explicitly using the term genocide for the Armenian genocide?
Okay. So to answer the first question, we, as we stated in our statement, unless there's an ongoing genocide, we tend not to get, committed by a leader. We tend not to get involved with internal domestic affairs of states. We're not a human rights organization, right? So we focus on human rights in as much as they're implicated in a genocidal process. However, we do, as a genocide prevention organization, call out denial. And we've been spending, years calling out Azeri and Turkish denial of the Armenian genocide and the role that it's playing in putting Armenia at risk, not just the Republic of Artsakh, but the Republic of Armenia at risk for extinction. And so to see some of that language show up in Pashinyan's statement was of grave concern to us. And it took us, we had to work on that statement very hard. It came out 3 weeks afterwards. Our statement came out 3 weeks after his. It coincided with huge protests in Armenia. We're an all-volunteer organization, so sometimes things take a while, So that was not planned. We actually didn't see that coming, but we could not allow, genocide denial to go unchallenged by us. This put us in a bad position because we support Armenian sovereignty and we support the right of Armenians to control territories that they've been on as indigenous people for thousands of years. So in no way did we want this statement to jeopardize that. However, it needed to be pointed out, just like, we point out denial by Biden, by Putin, by, Abiy in Ethiopia, by Somalis. We point this stuff out and we thought, well, we can't have this. We were set up not to have sacred cows. We cannot have sacred cows. Armenia is a democracy. Pashinyan's a democratically elected leader. I mean, these are all debatable things, but Armenia is, putatively a democracy, and he can take it. This is the type of criticism you get, when you engage in that kind of speech. With Manucharyan, we had debate about that, And there were different views within Lemkin Institute. So I'm going to let you know how the sausage is made, everyone is very opinionated in Lemkin Institute, and there are all sorts of different views, and we fight in a nice way about things, But every word that we write, we go over, 15 times. Should we say it this way or that way? So everything's very deliberate when it comes, so this was all very deliberate. We debated Manucharyan because many, societies have their own words for what happened to them. So for the Yazidis, it's Firman. For Jews, it's Shoah. So Manucharyan could fall into that category. This is what we say in Armenian when we're talking about this. Also, in his speech, he did use the word genocide at the outset of his speech, and then he shifted to Manucharyan. So we didn't focus so much on his use of Manucharyan because we felt that, from our perspective in that statement, we felt that there were other issues that we wanted to focus on. And I wasn't convinced, So there were others that were convinced, but I was not convinced that Manucharyan was a denialist strategy. So I'm open to debate on that, but we decided just not to cover that, so much in the statement, and to focus on where we felt he was victim blaming and where we felt that Turkish and Azeri responsibility was being sort of
diluted,
elided, that sort of thing. Yeah.
I just want to underscore how important it is when discussing this back and forth. We started with Manucharyan, and I feel that's incorrect because we are focusing on the red herring issue. The real issue, all of the Pashinyan policies and lieutenants, for instance, he's cutting ties with the diaspora. His lieutenants, like Hovik Manucharyan, which you mentioned, you cited in your statements, and then also Andranik Kocharyan's statement about, we need to count the exact. Those are, I think, much more or as important to analyze as the Manucharyan issue, which, in my opinion, again, is a red herring.
So why is it that world leaders want to avoid the use of the word genocide and find euphemisms instead? Because when they say Manucharyan, obviously they're talking about the Armenian genocide. Do they avoid the word genocide because it carries with it international legal consequences and obligations like reparations and restitutions and such?
Yes, right. Genocide is a legal term. Medzion is not,
Mm-hmm.
unless we treat it as a literal translation of the word genocide.
Okay. Oh, prior to all of this, we've seen you frequently, or at least prominently featured on Armenian public TV during interviews. But soon after this, you became the object of intense criticism, including associating you with the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. But I want to ask, from the Armenian government side, including the Armenian public TV and so forth, media, have you been contacted to explain your position on this?
No.
Any repercussions or responses from the Armenian government?
No. None.
Okay. All right. Let's move on then to some criticism you received from unexpected circles. Greg Sarkissian, head of the Zoryan Institute, which shares not an insignificant amount of a role in terms of genocide studies, and also they fund research projects, but has criticized your statement, calling for an apology to Nikol Pashinyan and quote, the Armenian people. So his article was published on the Zoryan Institute website, but in it, Sarkissian claims that it's his own personal views. So I'm not sure why he didn't use Facebook or social media, but it's unclear which Armenian people he's talking about. Clearly, it can be argued that a significant number of Armenian people, especially diasporans, are incensed at Pashinyan's own statements and the statements coming from his lieutenants that we talked about already. Nevertheless, the main argument in Sarkissian's article was this Metz-Yegern issue, which is irritating to me personally. I don't believe he talked about anything about the overall policy and the vector, that the Pashinyan administration is pursuing. And so the only focus, as far as I was able to discern, is that Metz-Yegern issue. How would you respond to Sarkissian's criticism? I know that your institute issued a response, but maybe it's worth talking about it here as well.
Sure, we haven't issued a response because, I feel like this is a diversion. I was very sad about this, to tell you the truth. Greg's an old friend, and we're open to criticism. We get criticized all the time. But I felt that the statement that he issued did not address what we were talking about. And it made two fundamental mistakes. One, he said that we did not mention that Pashinyan used the word genocide, and we did. It's there. It's not the main focus, right? But we did say that Pashinyan called it a genocide. And then he suggested that we somehow were saying that Armenia is facing a genocide by Nikol Pashinyan, that he was sort of, starting a genocide in Armenia. And that's really, that's not in there at all. And in fact, in the first paragraph, we suggest that's why we usually will talk about domestic affairs, but that's not what we're doing. In this case, we're calling out denial. So I feel that there was a misreading, and I thought that's pretty unfair, right? We've been friends for a long time. So I was sad about it. And it led to accusations that we're Darshnaks, right? And to tell you the truth, I have no problem with Darshnaks. I meet with Darshnaks. We talk to Darshnaks, but we talk to everybody. I meet with State Department.
Right.
I used to. They don't want to, but I used to.
But why is that a bad thing to begin with? But
with the ARF, why is that a bad thing? Do you know? I suppose there are Armenians that don't agree with the ARF. Yes, there are always political parties in the world. But yeah, I don't know why that would be a bad
thing. But that is, I think, in my opinion, a classic guilt by association, fallacy.
100%, but it's a shame when genocide prevention organizations go after each other, and it's just led to all sorts of problems. So Greg's letter, and he apologized privately afterwards, but I think that was predictable given the political realities in Armenia. My husband was called a Darshnak, which is fine. He has Armenian heritage, but he's not a Darshnak. And he's he's like married to the Lemkin Institute, and that's why the Lemkin Institute is Darshnaks. So there are these gender issues too, like I'm Darshnak. Lemkin, all of Lemkin is Darshnak.
Look,
my husband.
Yeah. Asbed and I are Darshnaks, if you believe, Pashinyan.
We are routinely accused of the same thing. Right, we're either Putin puppets or we are Darshnaks.
Oh yeah, we've gotten that too. Putin puppets, and we're apparently funded by Ruben Varsdanian and Robert Pocharian. As my interns say, like, oh, I can't wait till that money comes in, right? We don't have any money, right? So,
well, I for one am happy that you stopped the back and forth of the polemics and everything, because that really takes away from the point that you were making, that this is a genocide that was in progress then, this is completed right now. So. everything else is
I
secondary.
agree. And you know what happens in these situations where people are facing a genocide and yet the powers are so big that they seem overwhelming is that people lash out laterally. I've seen this everywhere, right? This is the problem with genocide, is that unity is needed when people are facing genocide, but the psychological stress, particularly when you're dealing with, populations that have experienced this in the past, can lead to great divisions. And so I think this is like a part of that, and we're just sorry that that's going on. But yeah, you're right. I just think it's a side issue. Even if we were Darshnaks, so what, right? If you agree or disagree with what we say, that's fine. It's, free, right? I mean, you're free to disagree.
Absolutely.
We never expect to be 100% agreed with, and that's unhealthy anyway. Lemkin Institute can make mistakes. I don't think this statement was a mistake, but it's not inconceivable, right?
Yeah, I mean, so definitely up to discourse. But let me go back to the substance of your statement. You talked about victim blaming. You talked about fudging with numbers. Can you tell us a little bit why, those things are necessarily problematic and what is the issue? Well, I know the issue with victim blaming, obviously. How does victim blaming affect the victim in general? And also in terms of, there were some statements about, well, unless we can get 1.5 million names on paper, including their address and so forth, then we can't really say that 1.5 million people died. Why is that problematic as well?
Okay. So victim blaming, as you mentioned, it's obviously very, very harmful. In fact, I think it's one of the most violent parts of genocide is the victim blaming, because it can create situations where all of that hostility and all of that hatred and all of that violence is internalized. And that itself has a very, what would you call, disruptive effect on the creation of identity, right? And the continuation of identity. So victim blaming is part of the crime. This is why we say that, denial is the first and the last part of genocide, right? And part of denial is that victim blaming. It's saying, look, we couldn't do anything else. We had to get rid of the Armenians. They were fighting, this is the Turkish line, they were in insurrection against the Ottoman Empire, and the Western world was trying to do away with the Ottoman Empire. And they aligned themselves with the Russians and the Western powers who wanted to do away with us. So we had to, this is, and it was war and we couldn't feed everyone. And so some people died. It's, Turks died too. That's the line, right? So victim blaming suggests, oh, we did something wrong. And okay, so let me get to the second point here, right? So alongside victim blaming, you have geopolitical realities that come out of genocide that don't change unless genocide is recognized. So one of the reasons Turkey is so powerful today is because there was never a real accounting. Turkey could still be powerful with a real accounting, but Turkey as it is today wouldn't, because Erdogan wouldn't be able to portray this new foreign policy, which is an old foreign policy of pan-Turkism and expansionism. These are genocidal ideologies, and they're continuing today because there was never accountability. In that geopolitical context, if Armenians start feeling that they're responsible for the genocide, and therefore they're responsible for Artsakh too, and the genocide, the second genocide, or whatever number you want to call it, right? But that genocide in Artsakh too, and they'll be responsible somehow for any coming genocide. That means that all of the really good genocide identification techniques that Armenians have developed over years and years of being victims of genocide are forgotten or intentionally sort of, what would you say, intentionally put aside, right? This is the problem. I was asked once to speak on how genocide trauma has impacted Armenians, this was to policymakers, impacted Armenians' assessment of foreign policy and their security. And I knew what the deal was. I was supposed to come and say, well, there's a kind of genocidal pathology that occurs in survivors, and that means they're always like with PTSD, they always think they're at war. They're always more worried than they should be. And, so I flipped it. I said, well, people who have experienced genocide actually are very good at identifying genocide early on, and they know the process, they know what it looks like, and we should listen to them, period, right?
Yeah.
But what you hear all the time in Western policy circles is that the Armenians are what's the word? Overly concerned with their own extinction in an irrational way. And that means, right, that makes it hard for Armenians to fight what's happening to them. It makes it hard for Lemkin Institute to fight what's happening to Armenians. It makes it hard for Genocide Watch or any other organization, right? It's a very effective denialist strategy. You all are crazy, right? And evildoers, people who do bad things, criminals, they always argue that, right? But we can't just let it be said over and over again without challenging that narrative, because it puts present day Armenia, the Republic of Armenia, internationally recognized as a sovereign state, at greater risk within this continuing genocidal geopolitical dynamic in the South Caucasus and the Middle East.
Okay, thank you for that. Today, we talked about mostly cases of Armenian interest, such as the Armenian Genocide, the genocide in Artsakh. But the manifestation of genocide worldwide is undeniable. Can you tell us what other areas in the world are you raising red flags about? We obviously have the cases such as Gaza. I'd like to know, for example, at what point did Gaza turn from a response to October 7 to a humanitarian crisis and now onto a genocide? What is your process or your steps with which you scientifically determine this procession?
That's a great question. So different organizations, as you note, right, have different methodologies. Genocide Watch uses 10 stages. That's a great methodology. We use patterns, and it's all on our website. And we have sort of a list of 8 steps that we go through, questions we ask ourselves as we're analyzing data. And we had already called out Israel as terribly vulnerable to committing genocide against Palestinians, right? And particularly a statement in a red flag alert in July of 2023 that unfortunately ended up being prescient. So immediately, because in that red flag alert, we suggested that if there's a spark, everything is set up in Israel to commit genocide. And what we were analyzing then was we were looking at genocidal speech from Israeli leaders, genocidal speech within the Israeli population, and then actions on the ground in the West Bank. Those are the 3 things we brought together on July 30th. And this suggested a state that's primed to commit genocide. And not only that, a state that's trying to, like these visits to Al-Aqsa or the Temple Mount, right? Trying to instigate a spark that will allow them the moral cover to start a genocide. So the minute this happened on October 7th, number one, the news that was coming out about what Hamas was doing was highly suggestive of genocidal intent, although it was not large enough to sort of morph into a major genocide at that time. But we mentioned that, right? On our October 13th was the first statement we made after this. But we also were pretty sure that Israel was going to commit genocide in response. And so we waited 6 days to see what Israelis were saying, what their, Israeli leaders were saying, what their plans were, what the media coverage was in Israel, what the external powers were doing. That was incredibly important, particularly the West, right? The allies of Israel. What's the overall plan here? And all of that suggested to us that there was a plan to commit genocide, but it was going to be done under the rubric of self-defense in order to, Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Advisor for the occupied territories, calls it humanitarian camouflage.
All over the world, there's been this new term that they use. They say anti-terrorist activities or special operations, and it just becomes a code word for others that they're going to deal with it the way they're going to deal with it.
I just want to say this here, and this is me speaking as myself, not as a genocide scholar, let's say, and not as the head of the Lemkin Institute, but there is a form of genocide that is being pushed as legitimate by the US, Israel, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and possibly the UAE as well. And we see this in Artsakh, we see it in Gaza, we see it in Ethiopia, we see it in Sudan. And, if you look at what's going on, these are very similar patterns, very similar denial strategies. And this is something we have to get a handle on. Otherwise, the Western world is going to cause unbelievable harm to all of us human beings, chasing after, who knows, some Timbuktu of gold and riches that none of us will benefit from. And that's my critique as a scholar, right, of what's happening. But it is really grave. And so these are not distinct little things. They're all part of a larger plan, I believe. And I think we have to be smart about that. And we argued at Lemkin Institute to the United States, just because Israel is your friend doesn't mean you allow it to commit genocide. It's like, don't drink and drive. You take the keys away from your friend if he's too drunk to drive, right? But when the US didn't do that, it becomes very clear, right? Actions speak so much louder than words. Everyone feels they will benefit from these genocides. They're allowing them to happen. They're seeking to change interpretations of international law, use language, and then if that's not enough, use police violence and the violence of the state to force us all to accept these genocides.
Where else is genocide occurring, or do you see rising risk of genocide around the world?
India. Huge rising risk of genocide. Genocides occurring currently in Ethiopia, particularly at this moment against the Amhara people. No one speaks about that. There are huge red flags of genocide against Somaliland by Somalia. No one speaks about that. That's a case that shares a lot in common with the Palestinians and the Artsakhs, because this is about indigenous territory and the denial of sovereignty. Of course, the Rohingya continue to experience genocide, but Myanmar seems to have moved towards a kind of total genocide against the opposition in Myanmar, not just Rohingyas, right? So they're using this happens all the time, but they're using the strategies of genocide that they used against the Rohingya against everyone now. Yeah, Russia's committing genocide in Ukraine against Ukrainians, particularly with its policy of child removal, which is so painful. China's committing genocide against the Uyghur. I know different political parties say, they'll include genocide for some of these and not others. We think they're all genocide. And then there are smaller genocidal sparks around the world that, we could talk about at a different time. But genocide is very much with us now. 21st century could be worse than the 20th century as a century of genocide. And it's in all of our interests. Really, if we want to survive as a humanity, as a species, we need to combat genocide, because with climate change, what are we going to have? We're going to have more and more people who are unwanted and who are considered a burden. And if we normalize genocide as a way to deal with complex problems or deal with people we don't really care about, that's how they're going to be dealt with. And climate change itself can be seen as sort of a genocide, right? So yeah, as a genocidal pattern or a genocidal structure. So all of these things, we need to create a global value system that puts human life first and human identity first. And last but not least, I will mention, this gets us in so much trouble. And I have to tell you, the anti-trans movement, there's some of the worst, right, genocidaires in the way that they respond to critique of their standing. Wow. They're the only ones that have put up photos of me and Irena on social media and called us out as trans and whatever else, right? Bizarre stuff. So but there is a global genocide against trans people, and it's organized by the radical right wing in many countries.
All right. We'll leave it there for today. We would love to have you back again to talk about some of these issues arising around the world, and we welcome for you to call on to us to cover something when something happens. Thank you, Dr. von Joeden-Forgey.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys so much. This has been really wonderful. It's been a great conversation. I'm very honored to have been invited. So thank you.
For us as well.
Likewise.
Thank you so much.
That's our show today. This episode was recorded on June 25th, 2024. We've been talking with Elisa von Joeden-Forgey, who is the Executive Director of the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention. More information is available in our world-famous show notes, so please go there. Please remember to support us. Go to our donate page, podcasts.groong.org/donate, and become a sustaining member of Groong and give monthly. Thank you in advance. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And this is Hovik Manucharyan.
Please follow us on social media and follow us everywhere you get your Armenian news. The links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.